Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and Media Vision. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Morris Moscovich, the Max and Gianna Glassman Chair in Neuropsychology and Aging in the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto. Originally from Romania, Dr. Moscovich moved to Canada as a child, became interested in memory research while attending McGill as an undergraduate. Tonight, he will speak on memory in the brain, past, present, and future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moscovich.
Today I'll talk to you about memory in the brain, and let's begin with something very simple. Who are my collaborators? My collaborators, I'm mentioning them right now because sometimes I forget at the end. These four individuals, and that's part of the topic of tonight's lecture. These four individuals, Gordon Winiger, Linda Dell, Mary Pat McAndrews, and Cheryl Grady, are my senior collaborators, and they're involved in one way or another in all of the studies that I'll be telling you about. My more junior collaborators, my students, trainees, postdocs, you'll get to know their names as their studies come up. So here's the brain. And we'll begin with the question, what is memory? Think about it for a second. I'll give you my definition. It's the lingering effects of experience on thought and behavior. Other people have other definitions, but this one suits me very well. The goal of tonight's lecture and my research career in general is to understand the relation between memory and brain function. So how many types of memory are there? Let's begin with that kind of question. Again, it's a question I'm putting to you, and you may have your own answer. Some people think that memory is unitary, that there is only one kind of memory. Memory is memory is memory. But other people think that there are many different kinds of memory. So here are some memory questions. You're going to have to play along that may help you think about the problem. Try to answer them in your mind, not out loud, except for one part where I will ask you to answer it out loud. What did you have for supper last night? Okay. Describe in detail a fun day from last summer. What you saw, what you did, what you experienced, every little bit of detail that you can. So think in your mind just at the beginning of choosing the time, okay? Where did you attend high school? Who were your best friends? Now, even though this question probably refers to something much more remote in the past than what you did last summer or what you had for supper last night, it's a very easy question to answer. Most people don't find this difficult. Why? What is the capital of France? What does chrysanthemum mean? How many windows are there in your house or apartment? Not so easy. And if you're like me, you have to take a walk through the house and imagine exactly how many windows there are. Very different from the other kinds of questions that you're asked. Okay, now this is where you have to raise your right hand as soon as you know the answer to the next question. I'll be looking, okay? Ready, set, go. Took a long time. And half the audience didn't answer. Maybe half the audience doesn't type. But we have what people call muscle memory, though it's not muscle at all. It's always brain. But this isn't a memory that you're consciously aware of. You know how to do something, but you aren't conscious of the memory that you have. And so what most people do is imagine themselves typing. Raise your hand. Even fewer people. And this is a perceptual memory. I'll tell you the answer if you don't know. On each side, it's the letter R and the letter Y, sorry, the letter Y. I can't even see it, do it right. Okay. Whose face is longer, Trump's or Obama's? Okay, think about it. Here's the answer. I would have said Trump. Other people said Obama, but the point is that you had a memory of it, you try to conjure it up and make a decision. Now, keep these numbers in mind and recite them back to yourself when I say go. Go. Okay, all right, good. Maybe, I don't know what the answer is. So is memory now unitary or multiple, of one kind or of many? I think these examples at least intuitively make you think that memory is of many different kinds. There isn't just one kind of memory. Each of these things that I told you about actually has a particular kind of structure in cognitive terms and probably a particular kind of structure in neural terms. One basic distinction is between short-term or primary memory, that memory that you have at the front of your consciousness that you use to hold those numbers in mind. Just to give you an idea of it, how many of you could recite those numbers back to me now? Well, the nature of short-term memory is that it's short. And unless you rehearse it, you lose all the numbers right away. But what we're interested in tonight is long-term memory. And even long-term memory is divided into different types. There's implicit memory, that's memory without awareness. That's the one about the typing, and it's called the motor or procedural memory. And the perceptual one was the one about what the keyboard looks like. It's a memory that you have, but you're not aware of it, and you have to dredge it up in funny ways. We're not going to talk about memory without awareness. But we're going to talk about explicit memory, or memory with awareness, or what people call declarative memory, because you can declare what you have. And they come in two types, or to take your things about quarks, two flavors, episodic and semantic. Maybe they'll even have an episodic quark and the semantic quark. Episodic memory entails recollection, re-experiencing the remembered event. So, for example, describe in detail a recent birthday party. You can relive it, and some people talk about it as mental time travel. You could put yourself back into that situation and imagine yourself reliving it. It's a very rich kind of memory. Semantic memory entails knowing, but there's no re-experiencing. Facts and general knowledge about the world, language, facts and general knowledge about yourself. To answer the question, where did you go to high school, you don't have to re-experience being in high school, you just knew the answer. The same as you would know the address to your house without having to re-experience going through the door. And then there's a third kind called schemas. These are adaptable associative networks of knowledge, fancy, frameworks is one way to think about it, extracted over multiple similar experiences. Not what does birthday party mean, which is semantic, but what happens at a typical birthday party, which is much more than the definition. You know a lot about birthday parties, just like you know a lot about lectures. So for example, coming in here, you knew what to expect. You knew there would be an auditorium. You knew there'd be a lecturer talking to you. You knew that you wouldn't answer any questions or speak while I was speaking. But you didn't know that I can sometimes break into a really funny dance. That's not part of a lecture. And if you do something unusual that breaks the schema, it becomes highly memorable if you can retrieve it. In fact, some people said that that's about the only thing they remembered about my lecture. So schemas interact with the environment and store knowledge to interpret the world and help form memory representations. Schemas prepare you for what it is that you're going to learn, whether it's reading a text or coming to a lecture. So these are the questions we'll address tonight. Are different brain structures implicated in these different types of memory? Memory is not static. It changes with time and experience and with age and disease. What brain changes accompany changes in memory? And memory does not exist for its own sake. How does memory contribute to other functions? So let me give you a sense of these different kinds of memories by looking at people who don't have them. These are three different patients. The first patient, KC, Kent Cochrane, is a person with episodic memory loss. He was in a motorcycle accident at 32, had a closed head injury, and damage following that to hippocampus, a structure that's crucial for memory. He has severe episodic memory loss, essentially amnesia, but relatively preserved cognitive functions, including semantic memory and schemas. So here's an interview with KC conducted by my colleague Endel Toving for a show in Canada.
Kent's short-term memory and intelligence were preserved, but he could no longer remember personal events from his past or retain new information.
All right. So I'm going to ask you some more questions about yourself. Could you please state your name?
Kent Cochrane.
And when were you born?
August 5th, 1951.
What is the address here?
1142 Brooks Drive.
All right. Let me now ask a few questions by way of general information. Do you know who was Louis Armstrong?
I think he was a jazz great.
Some time ago?
Yeah.
Is he still alive?
No.
Mm-hmm. What direction would you go if you went from Chicago to Mexico City?
South.
Why are dark clothes warmer than light-colored clothes?
Because they absorb the sun's radiation.
Let me ask you a few questions.
So you can see he's pretty intelligent. He's a little slow, but not because he's stupid or anything. He's just deliberate. But now so his semantic memory seems to be fine. Good general knowledge. Let's look at his episodic memory.
Most interesting thing that has ever happened to you?
I guess I don't know, yeah.
What about things such as graduation? Do you remember your graduation?
No.
Or your first date?
No.
Or some accident that has happened to you?
No.
Some interesting party you attended? No?
No.
Can you tell me about your brother, Roger?
He's dead now.
He's dead. How did he die?
I don't remember.
So, very intelligent, nothing there in terms of episodes. He knows a lot about his life, but he doesn't know how to re-experience any part of it. Perhaps he just has trouble accessing that information. So we're going to give him a clue by showing him a picture of a vacation that he took, that he was really excited about. We know this by interviewing his parents and his siblings, and knew it in great detail, told them all about it, years before he had this accident.
Recognize this picture? Why do you smile?
Oh, it's got me in the picture, but I don't recognize it.
So even the cue doesn't help. Let's contrast that with another patient, EL, who has semantic memory loss. At 62, he was diagnosed with a frontotemporal dementia, the temporal variant of it, which is called semantic dementia. And as you can imagine from the name, he lost his semantic memory. He has severe semantic memory loss, but strangely enough, relatively preserved episodic memory, as you'll see. So.
Because it started about I'm 65 now. It started when I was 62, 63, 64, 65. Now I'm sorry to say I've lost my brain.
Can you tell me
with what called the CBC, you know, for 30 years, well, then a long time ago. It was the 63, which downtime, and a long time ago, I used to drive. What do you call it? I used to drive a fiber, but I cannot drive now. Point to the floor. How far is the floor down now? Are we almost down there now? 2, yeah? I'll go down on that side, yeah.
Can you point to your watch?
Point to my watch. I don't understand. What's my watch? I don't know.
Can you point to the ceiling?
Point to the ceiling, it's here.
Yeah, point to the ceiling.
Well, I know that later on I'll have to go down and drive out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you point to your jacket?
Point to my jacket. I don't know, where's my jacket?
He worked as a graphic artist at the CBC, and I'm going to show you a picture of him drawing the way Velázquez did Duke Ellington. So you can't see Duke, you can see Duke Ellington, but you can't see him. And he's going to look at this picture and look at his reaction. Just show this.
You look at this, now I forget. Oh, yes, this is what I did.
That's right.
This was
Just wanted to get this.
This was a great man. He was a great man. I think from the other part down. Was it down? Now is this? We're in here in our calendar, but that further down.
Right in the United States. Show me. Oh, sorry.
Down here.
That's right. That's right. He's from down there.
Down here, yeah. And look, that's me there. And I drew this of him.
That's right.
I can't do it anymore.
Oh, sit down. That's okay.
Yeah. This was a great chance. This is me, and I used to do things like that, but now I can't anymore. I did that. That's me, and this was in the CBC as well.
Thank you very much. Very different reaction from the previous person who couldn't do it at all when he looked at the picture. Had absolutely no memory. It revived him a lot. So the last patient. This is a patient who has a memory distortion called confabulation. At 61, he had an anterior communicating artery aneurysm. He had distorted memories as a result of it. Confabulation is a kind of honest lying, but he had relatively preserved cognition. In this case, I don't have a video of him, but you can read along with me to give a sense of what's going on. I asked them, are you married or single? He's been married for 32 years and has 4 children. Married. How long? He says, about 4 months. How many children do you have? 4. And then he laughs and says, not bad for 4 months. So he knows that this doesn't make sense, but this is still what he believes. And now he has to answer this. How old are your children? Bob is 32, the youngest, Joe, is 22. That's also true. And then he laughs again, because you know what's coming, and he knows what's coming. How did you get these children? They're adopted. It's a strange disorder that's caused by damage in a different area from the other 2. So let's stop over here and take some questions about these patients or anything else that you had while we're talking about memory, and then we'll continue with the lecture when I'm told it's okay to continue.
I was just asking if the last patient was a politician.
Right. Or a Hollywood mogul.
If I listen to the rest of your lecture and the classifications of memory and try to map them onto the classification of memory that computers have, technical objects, computers have various sorts of memory. Will I get anywhere by thinking about that?
I'm probably not the right person to ask because I know very little about how computers work, even my own at a simple level. But my understanding is that no, you won't get very far. There are a sense in which we have our memories filed in some way, and that we need some cues or pointers to get to those files. But the way the memories are organized according to these different categories is not a way that one would necessarily organize them in a computer, nor would the computer, well, maybe now intelligent computers could do that, develop memories to suit what it is that you experience in life. Though at some point, maybe this is the way computers will organize their memories. At the moment, I don't think so.
So I can think of a classification of semantic memory for computers, of the analog, but I can't think of one for episodic memory. I can't think of a computational analog.
One reason that you may not be able to, I mean, it's not inconceivable to me that you may be able to have that in a computer, but an episodic memory is a memory with conscious awareness attached to it. Computers tend not to have that, or at least many people believe that computers don't have that. It may be possible to build that into it so that the computer has a sense of re-experiencing the past, though I don't know what that would mean in terms of computer programs. Schemas computers can have. They can have schemas the same way that they have semantic memories. But the schemas might not be organized or tied to episodes the way our memories are. And as you'll see, these memories are linked and one grows out of the other.
Thank you for joining us. You have been watching Dr. Morris Moscovich discussing the nature of memory. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Dr. Moscovich will present several illustrative patients with different memory disorders. Now, back to the talk.
So, are different brain structures implicated in these different types of memory? There are two approaches to answer this question, or that traditionally have been used. One is to study people with brain damage, and this is a person who's amnesic, who has damage to this region, the hippocampus. It's patient HM. And the other, a very famous patient who got the whole field going. The other is to study the activity of brain regions while performing a task. And these colored areas indicate which areas are most active under certain conditions. So where is KC's damage? KC has damage to the medial temporal lobes, including the hippocampus. That's this structure right here. And you can see how much smaller it is in KC compared to a control over here. Oh, sorry. So KC's damage, sorry, let me do that again. Does that help? No, you can't. Okay, so there's that little outline is KC's hippocampus, and it's much smaller than the outline on the right, which are the controls. This is the same thing, just a different view of the same structure from in his brain. He has other brain damage too, but we believe that his amnesia is caused by damage to the hippocampus based on all kinds of evidence that I won't talk to you about today. So let's look at the hippocampus. The hippocampus is that structure with those two little flags in it. It sits on the inside of the temporal lobes. So if you were to take an axe and chop your head right down the middle, just like that, and pull it out, this is what you might see, and you'd see the hippocampus lying on the, around the ventricles in the temporal lobes. The hippocampus is called the hippocampus because it resembles a seahorse. So there you have a picture of a seahorse and a hippocampus next to each other. And just as no one would say that the front end of the seahorse has the same function as the back end, we're now learning, and it took us quite a while to learn this, that the front end of the hippocampus behaves differently from the back end. The anterior part of the hippocampus, or the head, behaves differently from the tail. Now you can see where the hippocampus is situated inside the brain. It's surrounded by the temporal lobes on its outside, and in front is the frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, where the eyeball, to which the eyeball is attached. It's not attached to the prefrontal cortex in real life, but it's close to it. On an MRI scan, that circular region is where the hippocampus is. And this is another view looking along its longitudinal axis. From the back part is the tail, and the front part over here towards the left. Let's see, am I getting it? No, the other way around, sorry. That part over here is the head, and that part up there is the tail. Let's look at EL's damage. His hippocampi, as you could see in the middle over there on the two kind of lumps on the side, are pretty well preserved. What isn't preserved very well is the temporal cortex. You could see it's very atrophied, especially the temporal cortex on the left. These figures are reversed in radiological coordinates, but the temporal cortex on the left is shriveled. And that's an area that's involved in semantic memory, especially its anterior portion. And if you look at HW, his damage is in the prefrontal cortex, that region that is in red on the underside of the prefrontal cortex, but on the on the medial aspect. It's the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So the interim summary is that there are 3 types of long-term memory, and they're caused, damage to 3 different regions will impair one of these 3 different types. Episodic memory, however, arises from an interaction between new information with prior knowledge. I said that at the beginning. When you come in here to hear the lecture, you are already bringing a lot of prior knowledge so you can understand what I'm saying at the semantic level, and you have a scheme of what to expect during the lecture as well. We wanted to capture that when we were dealing with the memories of the patients that we have. So Brian Levine and I, and Brian Levine, Gordon Winokur, Janine Hay and I, designed an autobiographical memory interview that captures both types of memory, both semantic and episodic. So this is you could read along with me. This is a narrative that we got from a normal person, not from a patient. I used to play, not normal, I shouldn't say normal, a healthy person rather than a patient. I used to play badminton with his girlfriend, and I was very envious of her looks. We used to have lots of fun. However, one day we went from one building to another to get the badminton court, and there was quite an expanse, and it was wet and slippery, and she fell, and so on. Interleaved are episodic and semantic elements, and we wanted to classify them accordingly. Internal episodic details are those details that are unique to that episode, whereas external details are semantics and schemas that go across episodes, or things that some general knowledge that the person had. So this is how we classified. I used to play badminton. It's semantic because it was ongoing with this girlfriend. It's somebody she knew for a long time. And then go down where it says percep. And there was quite an expanse. So that's unique to that episode. And it was wet and slippery. Probably unique to that episode as well, to that day. And so on. And so we classify them according to whether they're episodic internal details or semantic external details. And you'll see why that's important in a second. The interaction between the hippocampus, therefore, namely that you have interactions between episodic memory and other forms of memory and knowledge, suggests that the hippocampus also interacts with structures mediating perception, semantics, and schemas. If you look at this connections of the hippocampus here, the blue connections from the posterior hippocampus connect primarily to structures in the posterior part of the brain that are involved in perception, so that you can relive the event that you remembered. You cue the hippocampus with a cue, let's say a favorite birthday party, and then the hippocampus has pointers to locations in the posterior neocortex that allow you to re-experience the event as if you were living it. The anterior hippocampus, the red part, connects to the prefrontal cortex on the bottom, the anterior temporal lobe with that large arrow, and some other structures such as the amygdala that are involved in emotion. And these structures are associated with schemas and semantics. So what my student Jordan Poppink decided to ask is, does it matter which part of the brain, the hippocampus, you look at to see if it's related to how good your memory is? So he looked at recollection, the ability to re-experience an event. This was in a laboratory controlled situation. And what he discovered is that the bigger the posterior hippocampus is, the better the recollection. And you can see that graph going the size of the hippocampus towards the right, how good your memory is up, and the better your memory, the better, the bigger the posterior hippocampus. So those of us with the posterior hippocampus have very good recollections, or can expect to have. Interestingly, the opposite holds for the anterior hippocampus. Why should that be the case? Why should having a large anterior hippocampus mean that you'll have poor recollections? Well, maybe people with an anterior hippocampus try to get the gist of every situation, the gist of the story, not its details. And therefore, if they tend to have that strategy, their recollection will be poor because they'll be paying attention or processing the information in a different way. Measuring brain activity with fMRI allows us to track the functional connections between these structures. So let's see what happens when you retrieve an episodic autobiographical memory. Here we had people sitting in the scanner, an fMRI scanner, while their brain blood flow in the brain was measured, and blood flow is related to the structures that are active. And they looked at pictures either of themselves from an album that they had, or pictures that were equated for style from another person's album. In the first case, they had to try to relive the experience where they saw that picture. In the other case, they just had to imagine what might have been happening. And what we can see is that it's not just the hippocampus that's activated. It is activated, but these are all the other regions that are activated, including in the anterior part, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and in the posterior part, the retrosplenial cortex, which is part of the posterior cortex. Now let's see what happens if you look at that slide only showed you which areas were active, but it didn't show you how the areas were interacted with each other. So suppose you now tell the person again, imagine yourself at a birthday party at your, let's say, your own most recent birthday party. Initially, in the construction phase, the anterior hippocampus is talking a lot to the prefrontal cortex, to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the other hippocampus to conjure up the gist of a birthday party and what it might have looked like. And then we ask the person to elaborate on it. Try to imagine all the details in it. And now, as you can see, it's not the anterior prefrontal cortex that's so active. It's now and the anterior hippocampus, rather, but it's now mainly the posterior hippocampus interacting with perceptual structures in the back of the brain, which is now on the lower part of the screen. So, this is by way of telling you how it is that the hippocampus interacts with other structures, which areas were damaged in these individuals that we talked about. And now let's again break for questions.
We all know, however, that sometimes when we remember something, we remember it wrong.
Yes, that's the last part of the lecture.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. But let me just, I don't want to just, trying to be funny, but it's a good question because it tells you when we remember it wrong that memory can't be a videotape or a stream of your life. What you do is you grab components here and there and then reconstruct memories most of the time. Sometimes they are a little like video streams, hardly ever exactly like it. But you take bits and pieces, and sometimes you pull the wrong piece in. And then you could be like a confabulator. He then, that's memory really gone completely off kilter. But we have similar kinds of mistakes, and we'll swear to our being right, as will our spouse swear that he or she is right. And there's no resolution unless somebody really was taking a videotape of the event that you're both talking about.
So we hear about certain parts of the brain referred to, say, as the reptilian brain. Is it possible to understand the locations of these various memory types on the basis of evolutionary need over the development of the brain?
Yeah, so the hippocampus is part of the reptilian brain, as is the amygdala. It's part of that circuit. I'm trying to give you a short answer. In rats, the hippocampus, the person, John O'Keefe, who discovered place cells in rats, won a Nobel Prize for discovering place cells. And he had the idea that the hippocampus is evolved to deal with spatial locations, where you are in the world. Because all animals need that. They need to get back home. They need to know where their kids are. They need to know where sources of food are. And that our memories, our event memories, these episodic memories, are built on a framework of space. And there's some evidence to indicate that that's the case. In fact, some evidence from our own studies, I'm happy to talk to you about them at the end, that suggests that that's not inconceivable. I'm not a firm believer of it, but I've become more of a believer than I was in the past.
We used to talk about right brain and left brain, where right brain was more visual and left brain is more linear logical. Are those obsolete terms now, or do they relate to what you're doing?
No, they're not at all. So if you damage the left hippocampus, didn't talk about this, it's not time to do everything. If you damage the left hippocampus, in most right-handed, and almost 95% of right-handed people, and the vast majority of left-handed people, will have a verbal memory loss or a verbal memory impairment. But their nonverbal memory is just fine because the right hippocampus hasn't been touched and the right hemisphere is the nonverbal hemisphere. And vice versa. If you damage the right hippocampus, you'll tend to have loss of spatial memory, but not necessarily loss of verbal memory. And these are very interesting questions to pursue. There are lots of open questions, but those ideas are not by any means antiquated.
I understand that memory is most of the time it's very acute and it has to do with a lot of association that we constantly bring back and help strengthen those associations, help with the memory. My question is, say if there's a memory from when you were 1 or 2, and I understand that some people forget about it, but what's your opinion on if it's permanent or not? Is it deep in there and you just have to find it, or does it actually go away eventually? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, it really is only an opinion. It's very hard to design experiments to know whether you have those kinds of memories. So let me say, you have to ask, what kind of memory are you talking about? If you're talking about episodic memories, so that you remember a particular event that happened when you were 2, I'd say unlikely that they're even there. Some people have memories that go back that far, but they're only 1 or 2 memories. They don't have, like the way I think about it, like a movie reel of memories. They have snapshots at that time. Other kinds of memories that depend on procedures or learning rules, those memories often get reinforced, or they may be there in the beginning and you can't shake them. So let's say being abused as a young child will have a lingering effect, and in some case, in some sense, you have a memory of that even though you may not be able to articulate it. And it then may create schemas that you have about how you approach the world. And those schemas then will determine how you react to the rest of the world based on those early things. So at the level of schemas maybe, and declarative procedural memories, I suspect they're there, but exactly how one gets at them, I don't really know.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Dr. Morris Moscovich. Dr. Moscovich is Max and Gianna Glassman Chair in Neuropsychology and Aging in the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto, Canada. In the second part of our talk, we learned how memory formation can be disrupted. In our final segment, Dr. Moscovich will talk about the connection between neuroanatomy and memory. Now, back to our talk.
What brain changes accompany changes in memory? So we talked about how do memories change with time and experience. A couple of questions already were related to that. One thing we know is that it takes a while for memories to consolidate. So after you've experienced something, if you were to get a blow on the head right after that, a concussion, you're not going to remember anything that happened to you prior to the blow on the head, and probably for a few days, for a few minutes or hours before that. I experienced that myself. So it takes time for memories to become consolidated and be permanent, change from one state, essentially, to a more permanent state. But they're never really permanent. Memories are transformed. They're forgotten, they're lost or inaccessible. Memories become general or schematic. You may remember your birthday party that you had last week really well, but if somebody asks you about a year from now, all you may remember is that you had one. And maybe you might remember one or two people who were there. Or memories are altered. They're added to or distorted as they are in the confabulation case, but as that lady asked, in fact, it's quite common that we change our memories. There's famous experiments where people are convinced that they had something happen to them merely by asking them a question, did that happen? They might say no, but after talking to them for a while, come back a few weeks later, they will say it did. You can insert memories. And a lot of this false memory syndrome has to do with the insertion of memories. As memories become generalized or schematic, they become independent of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is interested only in those very detailed memories in the posterior part and maybe some gist in the anterior part. As rich episodic memories become transformed, they become independent of the hippocampus. If their form does not change, they remain dependent on the hippocampus. So here's a person that people that we've scanned, and we asked them for autobiographical memories and looked at how much detail they had. Those people who had shallow memories, when you compare them to people who had very vivid memories, relied on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that part where the arrow is pointing, that contains the gist of what they experienced. People with very rich memories, highly detailed memories that are vivid, when you compare them to people with shallow memories, they will activate the hippocampus. Memories are also distorted. Elements are added and the order is changed. In order to look at that, we couldn't look at autobiographical memories because no two people agree with each other, even if they're at the same place at the same time. There's going to be some difference. So what we did is presented film clips to our college students, our healthy controls. There are 20-second to 25-second film clips. This is one from the Red Balloon. Those of us of a certain age will remember it as a short that won all kinds of awards in the 1960s about a boy meeting a girl and so on. What we did is presented 40 film clips and tested 20 of them immediately afterwards while the person was in the scanner. And then a week later, they came back and we tested the remaining 20 to see how memories changed over time. What we found behaviorally is that the general or central elements, the schematic parts of this story, it's essentially the theme of the story, didn't change very much from time 1 to time 2. Over a week, they remembered it generally very well. But the details, what was the boy wearing? What was the girl wearing? What color wall was there? What color were the balloons? And so on. Those things did change over a week, a lot. Kira McKelvey and Melanie Sakaris, a graduate student and a postdoc working with me, wanted to look at the effects of delay and memory typicality. Some of these clips were typical. That is to say, they conformed very much to a schema. They were ordinary memories. Others were atypical. They were very unusual. A typical memory was going through a grocery store, picking out some fruit and leaving. An atypical memory was going to a grocery store, picking up a fruit, and the fruit squirts you in the face. Now that is a shock when that happens, and as people said so. And what we can see is that if we test them immediately, there's really no difference between typical, atypical, or neutral memories. But after 7 days, the typical memories tend to be forgotten. People insert details that are consistent with the schema. The neutral memories, rather, tend to be forgotten, whereas the typical and atypical memories tend not to be forgotten as much. What areas are involved? Well, when you're encoding typical memories, the little red warm color, you tend to use your ventromedial prefrontal cortex because you can rely on schemas. When you're encoding atypical memories, you don't use that area so much because schemas aren't much good for atypical memories, and so you rely on the posterior neocortex where perceptual information is held. What happens if you come back and test them at retrieval? Let's look at the typical clips on the bottom. For typical clips, immediately afterwards, the hippocampus is very active. That's that big red blob. Because you can remember it. You can recover what just happened to you. A week later, the hippocampus is non-existent. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex is, and you tend to now rely on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to recover those memories. But for atypical memories, the hippocampus is very active at the beginning, and it continues to be active even at the end, where you get some additional ventromedial prefrontal cortical activity. And what's interesting is that, to answer your question about errors that are consistent with schema are positively correlated with activation of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex supplies the schema even though it didn't occur. So if you went to a birthday party, you say there was cake, and then your mother say, actually, no, there wasn't any cake that year. I just couldn't get it together in time. But you inserted a cake into your memory. Errors inconsistent with schemas are negatively correlated with activation of ventromedial prefrontal cortex, because there the ventromedial prefrontal cortex can't help you. What does damage to the hippocampus do? It reduces memory for peripheral details much more than memory for central elements. So let's go to the next slide. I think you can recover the information here, but not so much. If you look at the left, patients with medial temporal lobe epilepsy who have damage to the hippocampus tend to rely on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex much more than controls do. That's that top figure. Whereas controls tend to rely much more on the hippocampus. What happens with aging? Well, I can tell you now myself, I used to say, well, older people, well, people like me, we can't recover details as easily as we used to at one point. There's more reliance on, less reliance on details, recollection diminishes, and more reliance on gist or schemas. Well, what if we look at their brains? 18 to 88 years old, we tested, there are 100 people in each of these cohorts. And as you can see, if you go from 18, there's really a lot of activation in the posterior part of the brain that's connected to the posterior hippocampus, and very little activation and connection in the anterior part of the brain. But as you get older, the posterior part of the brain that looks like a bright blue sun at 18 looks like a brand new moon at the age of 88. But the ventromedial prefrontal cortex just before you hit your 80s seems to provide a lot of schematic information. At some point, even the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, I'm sorry to say, gives out. How does memory contribute to other functions? And this is the last part of the talk. Episodic hippocampal memory contributes to other cognitive functions. This is a list of them, but we're only looking at 3 of them: imagination, problem solving, and short-term memory of food intake, food regulation. Imagination and planning for the future. Imagination and planning for the future. For older adults, episodic details are reduced when you try to think of what will happen tomorrow. It's not what happened yesterday, but if you try to think what are you going to do tomorrow in detail, or the week afterwards, your performance is reduced, and you tend to rely on schematic details. Same with hippocampal damage. Episodic details are severely reduced for the future. Semantic and schematic details, not so much. So similar mechanisms are involved in remembering the past and imagining the future. What about problem solving? That often also requires imagination. So Signy Sheldon, a graduate student with me, looked at problem solving in young and older adults and patients with medial temporal lobe damage. We used a means-end problem-solving task. It measures real-life problem solving. It's conceptualized means of moving towards a goal, and you get 10 vignettes that are of a personal nature, and each describes an initial state followed by an end state, and you have to fill in the blanks in between. For example, this is made for undergraduates. For older adults in our study, we say so-and-so had a very close friend. H loved her boyfriend very much, but they had many arguments. One day he left her. H wanted things to be better. The story ends with everything being fine between her and her boyfriend. You begin this story when H's boyfriend left, and now you have to see how they get back together again. And there's ways to analyze it. There are relevant means. That's a step or action that gets the individual closer to achieving her goal. Or irrelevant means, a step or action that may be directed toward a specific goal, but not the right one. Or no means, person doesn't provide any steps. So for example, irrelevant mean would be you try to talk things over. Irrelevant mean realizes cannot make it work, so H gives up. No mean is wait a little while and then everything was fine. Actually, at my age, that's the right answer. You don't know that when you're young, but you learn it as you get older. You don't get points for it, though. We also scored it for types of details, internal and episodic, external and semantic details, just as we did all the other narratives. Compared to young adults, older adults had total means that were equivalent. They both provide the same number of means, but older adults had fewer relevant means. And as you can see, performance was related to the number of episodic details, but not to the semantic details. Why? Well, that means that when you're trying to solve an unusual problem, not one that you've always solved, but something unusual, you have to conjure up an episode, something that's similar to it, and conjure it up in as much detail so that you can relive it and then pull out the answers from that relived episode. What about patients with hippocampal damage? They resembled older adults, only worse. Is older adults' memory always worse? No, thank God. It depends on the test, the time of day. Older adults do much better when tested in the morning than in the afternoon. But college students aren't up in the morning to test older adults. So the people who test them tend to test people in the afternoon when older adults tend to be at their worst and younger adults at their best. And the age differences tend to get magnified. That's work by Lynn Hasher, done in my lab. So the last part, regulation of eating. How much we eat at a meal is influenced not just how bloated we feel, but by our memory of how much we ate, not indeed how much we ate. So we had our patients who were amnesic. They had damaged, they're amnestic. We asked them, how hungry are you? They wrote it on a scale. We gave them a full meal. They ate it. We took the meal away, had the patient rinse out his mouth, talk to us for 5 minutes, asked them now again. And at the end of the meal, they said, I'm satiated. Asked them again, 5 minutes later, how hungry are you? Same as it was before the first meal. Said, would you like some food? Oh, yes. Ate the second meal right away. Said he was satiated at the end. Waited 5 minutes again. Asked them, how hungry are you? Just as hungry as they were before. We didn't give them the third meal because we thought, who knows what's going to happen? They had already ingested around 2,500 calories. But that's true of us. In this paper in Science that appeared, Thought for Food, imagined consumption reduced actual consumption. So they had people in an experiment and asked them to think about the recent meal that they had and try to think in about as much detail as they could. At the end of the experiment, they said, okay, thank you very much. Here are some cookies. Thank you for participating. Take what you want. Those people who imagined a recent meal in great detail took fewer cookies when they left than those people who didn't imagine in such detail. Eating while watching TV is not good for dieting. Those who you look at how much people eat while they're watching television, they eat more than people who don't watch television as they're eating. Why? Not because you're distracted, but because you don't remember. Distraction causes you to forget, and you can't keep track of how much you ate, so you eat more. Here's the last of these studies. These are 3 different types of popcorn: no salt, medium salt, high salt. That's not important. But what you can look at is that people were asked before they were given the popcorn to take as they went out, imagine your lunch from yesterday versus imagine your lunch from today. So everybody can remember what they had for lunch today. We're hard put to remember exactly what we had for lunch yesterday. And indeed, your consumption accords to that. People who can't remember their lunch as well tend to eat more popcorn, no matter how tasty it is, as compared to people who remembered their lunch very well. So the conclusion. The hippocampus represents detailed memories of episodic events from global to local details along its longitudinal axis, from anterior, which is global, to posterior, which is local or detailed. The posterior region interacts with perceptual structure in posterior neocortex, and the anterior region with schema structures in medial prefrontal cortex and anterior temporal lobe. As memory is transformed from detailed to schematic representations, there is a shift from hippocampal to neocortical involvement, or put in a better way, from the posterior hippocampus to anterior to ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Both are needed for a variety of non-memory functions such as language, imagination, creativity, problem solving, and even food regulation. Thank you very much.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.